I'm pulling my driveway. We all know what that means. It's time for another drive to work. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about one of my hobbies and how I've applied a lot of lessons I've learned from that hobby to magic design. So the hobby is party throwing. So my wife and I, Laura, my wife, we have been together since 96. So we've been together a long time. And one of the things we learned very early on is that both of us enjoyed throwing parties. Obviously, we throw birthday parties for the
co-host of Lucky Paper Radio, Anthony. Happy birthday, Anthony.
One plus one is seventh heaven. It's Lucky Paper Radio. I'm your host, Andy, and I'm here with my co-host, Anthony, birthday boy Maddox. Happy early birthday, Anthony.
Hey, happy birthday to you too, Andy.
Hey, wait a minute. Hold on, pump the brakes. It's not my birthday, actually. Mine's not for a while, but it is coincidentally. We're recording this on Friday. Your birthday's tomorrow, Saturday, and then we found out that Sunday is Lucky Paper contributor Jet's birthday.
It'll be a whole birthday bonanza.
What are the chances, Anthony? What are the chances?
We're all becoming olds.
Do you understand that birthday paradox? Can you explain it to me?
What's the birthday paradox?
The birthday paradox is that thing that basically says, in order for you to have more likelihood of having two people share two birthdays in a group of people than not, you need substantially fewer people than most people expect.
I mean, my way to summarize those kinds of weird statistical questions, and we should ask a different Lucky Paper contributor to give a better answer, but how much more likely or how equally unlikely is it for everyone to have unique birthdays?
Yeah, that is the way it's been described to me too, and it still feels like it's not it should be less probable. So do you want to guess right now, if you're not looking at the Wikipedia page, how many people do you think you need until you have a greater chance of having a pair of the same birthday rather than not?
I'm gonna guess 60.
23.
Jesus. Okay.
Right? It's really low. It's not that many people.
It's really low.
Still don't really get it. It's still kind of confusing to me. Anyway, I'll put the Birthday Paradox Wikipedia page in the show notes. We almost had a Lucky Paper Birthday Paradox. Among only 4 contributors, we had 2 almost sharing a birthday, but not quite. Any birthday plans, Anthony?
I'm really excited. I think I'm going to scrub the stove. What was the other thing I wanted to do? There's something else very exciting along those lines.
Stove cleaning.
We
know what we should do now, Anthony? We should record a podcast for your birthday, because that's what the people demand. A podcast about magic. And Cube, in fact.
If that's what we want, shit. If that's what they want, we can't refuse.
Maybe I'll edit that out, maybe not. We'll see.
Hey, it's my birthday. I'm having an identity crisis. Am I me or am I you?
All right, let's go ahead and just move on to our Pack One, Pick One segment. Every week on the show, we do a Pack One, Pick One from a listener-submitted cube. And this week's cube comes to us from listener Forrest716. This is a 3-color focused cube, so it's trying to encourage 3-color decks and emphasize the shards and the wedges. And Anthony, you'll be delighted to see a huge number of gold cards in this list. 119 of the 360 cards in this list are gold. I know that makes you happy.
You love to see it.
You do love to see it. You really, truly do. I'm going to read the pack. Anthony is going to tell us what are the leading contenders for him, for his Pack One, Pick One, his birthday Pack One, Pick One. The pack is...
You're leaning on the birthday stuff a little too hard. We didn't need to bring it up.
Look, I had nothing else prepared. I just got to keep saying that over and over again. The pack is Thoughtseize, Phylath World Sculptor, Cloudblazer, Disenchant, Scapeshift, Hallowed Fountain, Llanowar Elves, Alluro Ageless Ascetic, Breeding Pool, Skullclamp, Monastery Mentor, Prismatic Vista, Oko Thief of Crowns, Orcish Lumberjack, and Polluted Delta. I'm seeing a lot of powerful cards in this pack. Anthony, what is jumping out at you?
There are a lot of powerful cards, and there's also a pretty big difference in terms of power level that I see. Before we go too deep into it, have you ever actually played with Orcish Lumberjack in Cube?
I have not, though I have thought about it quite a bit. If this was not actually a gold card, I would be so into it, because I love tempo-forward plays like this. For those not familiar with it, Orcish Lumberjack is red for a 1/1, summon Orc, And it has an ability, tap to sacrifice a forest and add 3 mana, any combination of red and or green to your mana pool. So it's like a repeatable dark ritual that instead costs you a land instead of a spell, and can, on turn 2, ramp out a 4-drop very reliably, or pretty reliably, if you're in exactly red-green. It's that if you're in exactly red-green that keeps me from trying it in my own environment.
Right. But this cube is specifically trying to push us to play multicolor decks.
Right.
So let's just say, that's the card that I look at and I'm like, I think this card is much more powerful than I think it is, but I haven't really had a lot of experience with it, so I'll wait for it to be proven to me. So aside from that, the 3 cards that really stand out to me are Skullclamp, Oko, and Polluted Delta.
You're much higher in Polluted Delta than a Prismatic Vista at this stage.
I think so. That's a good question.
What's your reasoning there? Just that there's enough fetchable lands that you think that's going to be playable in any color of deck, or what? What's your
so I'm thinking specifically, if I'm expecting to play 3 color, even though it only fetches two colors,
sure.
It's both going to double fix me for 2 colors and is much more likely to make my main deck. So that's why I like it more specifically in this context. Yeah, I think if I'm expecting to play a 2-color deck, I think I probably like Prismatic Vista more.
I'm looking at a very similar suite of cards, so I would put Prismatic Vista up there in contention too. I'll also throw Thoughtseize in the mix. I mean, Thoughtseize is always a great card. It's just a black mana to make your opponent discard a card of your choice, and it's not a land card, and you lose 2 life. And I think that card might shine in an environment where people are playing greedier decks on average. If you can Thoughtseize your opponent and take one of the only 2 cards they can cast until they draw their 3rd color of mana or something, it can be even more of a big setback. What are the cards here that go down in value for you, knowing that this is an environment pushing us towards 3-color decks?
Can everything just go up? Is that how games work?
I'll say I think I put Llanowar Elves more low in an environment where I think we're all going to be playing 3-color decks. Not to say that
to your point about Orcish Lumberjack, if we're all playing 3-color decks, it's going to tend to be less about tempo, I think, than just about value. So I think both those cards, just as pure tempo cards, take a little bit of a hit.
Yeah, that and yeah, I agree. That and I think that there's probably a lot of fixing in green. I'm looking at the list now, so you can probably play a base green, splash lots of other colors kind of list, or any of the base green tricolor pairs with Llanowar Elves. But in a regular cube, it fits into those decks as well, but also can be part of a mono green super ramp deck or something, and that's not going to come together here, it looks like, from the makeup of this list. So I'm a little lower on that. This is a really hard pick. So what are you actually taking? You're looking at Delta, Oko, and Skullclamp. I'm pretty much looking at the same cards. I would probably take Vista over Delta, probably. And I think Thoughtseize is in the same stratosphere, but what are you actually going to take, though?
So I think I'm actually, in general, in my own card evaluations, a little bit high on Skullclamp in these high-powered environments, so I think I'm going to tune myself a little bit and stay away from Skullclamp. I think I'm just going to take Oko because I don't want to I just don't want to hear the response of the person to my left when they say, "You passed Oko?"
I mean, that's a reason. I'm going to say the same. Not for that reason. I do think Oko is... we've talked about how there are a suite of cards in most cubes that are better than even premium fixing, and pretty much no matter what the cube is at whatever power level. I think this pack has 2 or arguably 3 in Oko, Skullclamp, and maybe Thoughtseize, depending on your predilections. I don't think we have to read Oko's rules text. I think people know that card. Or Skullclamp, I hope. So yeah, I think I'm just going to take Oko. Given that there's 3-color decks supported, I'm expecting that there's not going to be super duper aggressive decks, which is probably where Oko is the least effective, though he's still quite good in that matchup. And in anything resembling some kind of board stally mid-range mirror or any kind of grindy game, Oko is near impossible to beat, I would say. So I'm quite high on him, and I'll just take him here.
All right, let's do it.
Anthony, we did it. We didn't pack one, pick one of fetch, even though there were 2 in the pack.
Wow.
Aren't you proud of us?
So I should put a little asterisk and say, if I was trying to really lean into this cube and embrace what the cube designer is doing, we should probably just take Scapeshift, right? No one puts Scapeshift in a cube just incidentally.
I mean, that doesn't mean I'm going to take it, but I hear what you're saying. You're saying Scapeshift jumps out of this pack. Scapeshift is 2 green for a sorcery that says sacrifice any number of lands and then search your library for up to that many land cards and put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. So you're paying 4 mana and a card to not increase your board presence at all. You're going to sacrifice some lands and replace them with that many lands from your library. But this card is notorious for having various combos and synergies and build-arounds that make it relevant in Constructed. So you're saying this card kind of stands out because you would normally not expect it to be something you would want in a cube where you can play Thoughtseize and Oko and Skullclamp. But you're saying if it's in this list, you could trust the designer and say, well, it must be here for a reason. Let's see what I
Gotta
can
be
do
here
with it.
for a reason.
I'm looking at the list now. Let's see. So Gruul seems to have a little bit of a landfall thing going on, but not so many that I'm going to be thrilled to play Escape Shift, I don't think. Jund has some sacrifice stuff, which of course...
But see, you're
Escape
making a
Shift
mistake. You're looking at the
triggers.
list. We need to trust in the designer and trust in the heart
All
of the
right, fine.
cards.
I don't know the pack. I'm still not taking that. I'm taking Oko,
We're gonna
but
take
I hear what
Oko,
you're
okay.
saying. That was a great birthday pick, Anthony, for your birthday Pack 1 Pick
Wow.
1 on
This
this
is
birthday episode of Lucky Paper Radio.
Incredibly
Thank you,
embarrassing.
Forrest716, for sending in your cube. If you want to get on our queue to have your cube drafted on Lucky Paper Radio on the air, you can mail it to mail@luckypaper.co and include your pronouns, include a link to your cube, and we'll do it on air. Small note, if you send us an email with your cube list and then you change your cube's ID on Cube Cobra, your link will break, and I will no longer have a link to your cube. So just keep that in mind when you're changing that cube ID. Not to say you can't change it if you don't want, but just be aware, you know? It's a thing you should know. Anthony, this week, we're going to talk a little bit about restrictions as kind of our light theme. I want to start with this message from a listener.
Not all uncommons are created equal. Cards like Channel, Soul Ring, and Library of Alexandria would never be printed today, and especially not at uncommon. Skullclamp was clearly a huge mistake. To avoid power outliers like these, I've been using the established Legacy ban list for my Peasant Cube. The Legacy ban list has made a lot of sense to help curate a fun and balanced environment for my list. But this last week, Arkham's Astrolabe was banned in Legacy. The card is definitely a design mistake for Constructed, but it's totally fine and reasonable for Cube. It's causing me to reevaluate the best way to make a ban list for Peasant. Glad that in the end for Cube, the best approach is the way that makes the most fun environment for any given group. I think the ban list should reflect the goals of the Cube. So I'd love to know how and if you form ban lists for Cube, and which commons and uncommons you think push the power level too far for Peasant.
I think it's really interesting, and I think I want to sort of point out the distinction that he's making between, like, you know, we've joked about banning cards from Cube in the past, but obviously no cards are banned from Cube. That's one of the best things about the format. But there is still a reasonable and important distinction between cards that you're not including because they are, like, actively destructive or sort of like they cross a line in sort of your design goals that you don't want to include them, versus cards that you're not including just because they don't quite make the cut. So it's like, there's all these great 5-mana red dragons, I could include any one of them. It doesn't mean the other ones are banned or, like, are unreasonable and I would never consider them. It just means, well, I had to pick one. And in this particular context, there is this kind of weird restriction in these sort of rarity-restricted cubes where, like, the design of Magic cards has changed drastically in the last, 26 years? That some of the cards just don't fit anymore into the same sort of design philosophy. And as much as some people, I think, enjoy that about these rarity-restricted cubes where they can play this, like, interesting, like, very stretched power delta because there are these outliers, I think there's a very good line of logic to just excluding those power outliers to try and fit with a more unified design philosophy.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions here, and I think the first thing to address is just why use the Legacy banned list at all, right? Like, we're playing Cube. We don't have to adhere to any formal ban lists. So it sounds like Nate is using the Legacy ban list as a sort of shorthand to say, well, some of these uncommon cards were just mistakes, and I know they're mistakes enough if they make it all the way onto his banned list, but now he's presented with this first obvious example of a card that he knows to not be a problem in his environment, Arkham's Astrolabe, which I would agree. Arkham's Astrolabe is a very good rate for a card, but it's certainly not broken. No one's going to win the game on the back of Arkham's Astrolabe, so it's probably a totally fine inclusion in Singleton in a drafted environment. It's very easy for us to say, do whatever is makes sense for your cube, and that's all that matters. And at the end of the day, that's true. You shouldn't hold yourself to any limitation, arbitrary or not, if you think that something else is going to better serve whatever your goals are. And so the easy answer for Nate is just keep Astrolabe in, pretend you never saw that banned and restricted announcement, and your life can go on, because you know it to not be a problem. But I think that it's worth underscoring why so many cube designers like Nate do adhere to some semblance of ban lists, and the sort of value of that, because designing a cube is such an incredibly complicated task. I was having this conversation the other day in one of the sort of custom cards channels. We were talking about just balancing a single card, right? And we always give the example of Lightning Bolt because it's very simple. 1 mana, instant speed, 3 damage. You can think of, on that very, very simple card, you can think of so many knobs to turn, right? We could make it sorcery speed. We could increase the mana cost. We could decrease the amount of damage it can do. We could change the legal targets for the card. We could set some casting restriction on it or some additional cost in the style of the call time cards, like exile a creature card from your graveyard to cast a spell or something. There's all kinds of knobs you can turn. And for any given environment, you can turn those knobs and try and dial it in so that Lightning Bolt is like fair and balanced. It's the right power level. It's not a big outlier in either direction. It's very playable. When you design a cube, you're selecting a card, and you can it's not a linear curve like turning a knob, but you can kind of think of every single slot in your cube as turning a knob. It's affecting your environment and what's playable and not playable. And if you start out with no preconceptions, you're like, my cube can be anything. I'm not going to aim for the highest power level within a certain restriction. I'm not going to have any restrictions. I'm not going to say I'm going to be Singleton. I'm not going to say I'm going to be Peasant. I'm not going to say I'm going to adhere to the Legacy banned list. There is so many options that I think it is genuinely overwhelming. You need some very strong seed for where to start to actually to be able to place the first tile on the cube, right? And then have that grow from there. And so I think if you have a very, very, very clear vision for what you want your cube to be, and I can give the example of like the Turbo Cube, for example, is a very clear vision to me. It's like, we have this novel rules change. The vision is explore the variety of cards that are totally broken or modified by this rules change and how they might interact with each other. And from that, you don't need any other restrictions really to guide that. You can just kind of
It's really funny to me that you bring that up, because I feel like of all of the cubes that I've designed, which is 7 or 8 at this point, that was one of the more challenging ones for me.
You think because of this lack of any kind of restriction?
Yeah, I mean, it just felt like there was not such a seed. I mean, to go back for a second, I feel like something you sort of hinted at was like, we never want to tell you, like, this is the right way to do a cube. Cube should be this thing. And to say, like, you should do whatever is right for your cube and not fall too hard on your restrictions is kind of intimidating and overwhelming. To say, like, oh yeah, just ignore that, you can do anything. And just leaning
right, it's
back
kind of like
on,
saying draw the fucking owl, right? It's
yeah,
like
yeah,
someone asks, how do I draw an owl?
Right.
And it's like,
yeah, what, like,
start
why
with 2
are
circles and then you draw the rest of the fucking owl. Just do it,
So it's sort of like when we talk about heuristics, like it might be a less optimal in, whatever kind of abstract way we want to describe the optimal cube design to meet whatever set of goals is, to say, well, I'm just going to use this list of restrictions from this constructed format. But that can definitely be the higher value approach for your, experience. Like, to say you're not going to worry that much about it because you're going to get 90% of the benefit of just using this ban list or this restricted list to get the list of cards that you're going to pick from, just might save you enough time or mental effort, or just, let you focus on what's actually interesting to you. That's right. A completely reasonable strategy.
And for your benefit, I think I'm looking at the Legacy restricted list right now, and there are other uncommons that could be considered for Nate's list that presumably right now are banned. So I'm looking at stuff like Mystical Tutor, stuff like Sensei's Divining Top, Gush, Treasure Cruise.
So you're missing out on a couple cards, but at the same time you're making up for it in terms of there are all these conversations you don't have to have with your players. They're like, well, why aren't you playing Gush? It really should be here.
That, but also, like, I don't want to minimize the amount of time it would take to determine if Gush was a problem in a Peasant cube.
Absolutely, yeah.
I don't think it would be a matter of a playtest or a couple of playtests. I think for you to get to the point where you were like, this is actually warping my environment in a unhealthy way, as opposed to being a powerful draw to be in blue or a compelling build around or something that is serving one of your actual goals, it would be a ton of work. And so you are actually shortcutting a ton of work by saying, and I presume, maybe we're wrong about this, I presume Nate's cube, using this ban list, the way it was presented to us, I assume that Nate is pushing the power limits of Peasant Cube, right? Playing kind of the best uncommons he can within this restriction of no cards on the Legacy ban list. Now, I would argue that a card like Gush is very similar to Arkham's Astrolabe in that it is not the kind of card who in which a big power level delta is going to cause a huge problem. Some of these cards I think would be totally fine inclusions, but to your point, just having that shorthand and saying this is my ban list is a great place to start to make some progress, because otherwise you find yourself unmoored in this sea of potential options. And not only is it that testing any one of these cards would be a lot of work to determine whether or not it was actually too powerful or not, but then also, if you determine, all right, this card's actually fine, that moved the goalposts in some way. Maybe that card being fine for your environment and being at the higher end of the power level curve, but still within the realm of what you consider an acceptable delta, means that other cards in your cube are now evaluated differently, or other cards you already excluded months ago before this card were in now are contextualized differently and need to be reconsidered. And so it's this like treadmill feedback loop where every change changes the cube, and now you have to rethink of all the other things you already thought of because now the cube is a different cube.
I mean, we're getting deep. Like, that is what is fun for most of us about Cube, right?
I think so. I mean, this is like totally hokey, but I really love that famous quote from the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, which is that no man steps in the same river twice because it's not the same river and it's not the same man, which is just the point that, you know, a river is not a fixed thing.
That's so hokey.
It's cheesy, but I really do love that quote. And to me, I think Cube is very similar. Your players are different players every time they draft it, so are you. And your cube is also different every time you swap even one card out. It is now a somewhat different environment. And it's very easy, as we talked about with our boiled frogs language, to make a series of very small changes where the delta between the cube before and after the change is only a small step, but you do many, many small steps over 6 months or 12 months, and now your cube is radically different, and you didn't stop to reevaluate every card that was just kind of gliding on your good graces and didn't go noticed by you. That's why I think that restrictions are so prevalent in the cube community, because absent them, it can be very hard to know where to draw lines for yourself. Now, that said, coming back to Nate's specific question, you know, Nate is a listener to our show. I know Nate to be a relatively experienced Magic player, have his cube for a while. I would say, Nate, that I think this was a great starting point for you, and if you want my subjective opinion on what you should do, I think you should ignore the Legacy ban list, because I think you have a good enough grasp on your environment that you can look at Treasure Cruise, Sensei's Divining Top, Arkham's Astrolabe, and decide for yourself, are these cards too good for my environment, or do they add something that I think will be interesting to include in my environment? I think you're kind of past that point where you're really benefiting from that restriction, and I think that's what caused this message, right? Like, I think you kind of know that, otherwise you wouldn't have asked. You'd be like, yeah, well, it's banned now, it's coming out of my cube, but you were like, well, wait a minute, it's totally fine, why can't I just keep it?
I mean, I think there's actually two sort of aspects to this question. One of them is just the fact that, like, Cube is not constructed. We're playing a Singleton environment. It's a draft environment. You're not going to end up with all of these cards in the same deck. So the problem with a card like Arkham's Astrolabe just does not come up in Cube at all, right? It is not warping the format. It's not forcing you to play weird basic lands. It's not enabling these like bonkers 5-color decks that are only playing basics, so they don't have the restriction of playing against Blood Moon. Like, none of that is relevant. And again, like, this is all with the caveat that, like, playing with that ban list makes sense and offers you a lot of value, but if we're going to be critical, it's clear that this is a different format. I said two things, didn't I?
I think you might have, but I forgot already, so I'm sure our listeners did too.
The other thing is that you're not trying to curate the same format. Like, if you're comfortable with a higher power level delta, that's fine. So it's not just a matter of trying to draw the cleanest lines and saying, like, well, these cards are banned in Legacy because of power level, so we need to restructure that for our Peasant Cube environment. You can also just say, like, this one card, which is going to be played in, you know, a certain number of games per draft, that's not going to be overwhelming, but it is power level. It is very powerful. That's completely fine for you to just say that you enjoy that and that's worth including. So I don't think it's just a matter of drawing lines around power level either.
Sometimes when I see a Legacy cube, it's clear that it's a designer who is just adhering to the Legacy ban list, and that's where they got the name Legacy Cube, right? They're saying, I'm excluding power and all these other cards because they're not legal in Legacy. That's the guiding restriction for my cube. I have also seen cubes that were called Legacy cubes where it was clear the intent was for this cube to play like the meta of constructed Legacy. And if I'm not getting my listeners confused, I believe that Nate has described his own Peasant Cube in that way, or like basically wanted his Peasant Cube to play like Legacy from a few years ago or something, you know, before all these sort of new cards got injected into the format and things got shaken up. So that is another reason to use a ban list, right? Like, if you actually want your cube to resemble the constructed decks that are prevalent in that format as much as it can within a drafted environment, then you might want to exclude cards that would create new kinds of decks that do not fit in that meta, even if they're not too powerful, right? Even if when they're drafted, they're significantly less powerful than when they're in a constructed deck. That is still a reason you might adhere to that restriction.
Yeah, I mean, it is, the more I think about it, the more it's challenging because constructed plays out so differently, and you can't, like, build a deck around individual cards in a Singleton environment the same way you can in a constructed format.
Sometimes, if you are trying to emulate the play patterns of a specific constructed format, in my experience, oftentimes that involves playing cards that are not even remotely present in that environment. And the best example I can give of this is just, the Degenerate Microcube did not explicitly start out as a goal to emulate constructed Vintage. It was just trying to see how broken I could make 15-card decks in general. And it just so happened that there was a lot of overlap with the Vintage metagame, and I ended up learning a lot about those decks from looking at those lists and watching some Vintage matches. But given that it is still Singleton and it is a different format, I found that there were actually cards that were viable in my cube that were not viable in Vintage, but still contributed to the vintagey feeling of the environment because of the tempo ramifications, because of how threatening they were, because of how they forced you to think about keeping or mulling hands. Like, they cause you to make the same kind of decisions you might have to make in constructed Vintage, even though the actual cards themselves were totally different cards. And so that's a question for you to ask yourself, Nate, is what is it you like about this era of Legacy you're trying to replicate? Is it that you really like those specific cards and strategies, or is it that that particular era of Legacy led to a kind of gameplay that is something you're trying to pay homage to, and that might involve playing cards that weren't present in the meta at all? I always come back to your cube, Anthony, which you describe as a kind of like peasant cube, even though you include a fair number of rare cards. Those rare cards might, in many cases, play just like uncommons for all intents and purposes.
Yeah, I mean, especially we're talking like the uncommon legends from Dominaria and beyond. Those all would have been rare if they were printed a year earlier.
Right. So I think that's my advice for Nate. With the information I have, Nate, I think you should abandon the Legacy ban list in your Peasant Cube and go forward with your knowledge as a designer and make the decision that's right for your environment. But if you're listening to this and you don't feel like you have as good of a grasp on your environment, or you're just starting a cube, I would be more likely to take up a restriction, because it gives you a place to start, and it gives you a thing you can say is a kind of a pillar, right? If you say, I'm playing this ban list, therefore I'm excluding these cards, but I'm playing all the cards that just, are right below that power level, right? Like I'm not playing, I can't even think of peasant cards that are close to being banned in Legacy but aren't, but you know what I mean. Whatever the best cards in Peasant are, your lightning bolts or whatever, you want those cards to be playable, and that gives you a pillar, right? So now you get to compare any new card that you consider including against the cards that you have some indication are going to be for sure in your environment. And that pillar, I think, is so important to beginning this feedback loop that is cube design, where you are constantly adding and removing, and this whole thing is just a spinning gyre of changes in cards, and you get to ride it out. And you may find yourself 3 years down the line, cutting those cards in a totally different place. But to get started down that path, I think it's really helpful to have solid footing, and restrictions provide that, I think.
It's not worth it for Arkham's Astrolabe, though. No one likes this card. Don't play it.
I like Arkham. Wait, you love Prophetic Prism. You're saying you don't like Arkham's Astrolabe just because
why is it
steps
gotta
on
say
Prophetic
snow?
Prism's territory?
I'm not gonna say like, although I'm gonna add this complete exception. All of my basics are this totally different thing, just so you can play a discounted Prophetic Prism.
Okay, to be fair, Nate might play a ton of snow cards for all we know.
Still hate it.
I have that problem right now in the Degenerate Microcube. I have 2 snow cards in the entire cube. It's Arkham's Astrolabe and On Thin Ice. And both cards are just 1 mana upgrades over other cards that do essentially exactly the same thing. And I can't decide if it's worth keeping snow just for that reason.
I mean, just take a Sharpie. Just take your Prophetic Prism, cross out the 2, put a 0 there. I don't care.
They already have Arkham's Astrolabe, though. Here's what it does do, Anthony, though. It keeps me from going down a rabbit hole of acquiring exotic basics for my Degenerate Microcube. If they're snow basics, then I just get the Ice Age original snow basics and call it a day.
Interesting. You don't want the Eldraine Secret Lair snow basics?
No, I don't like those.
Huh.
Yucky.
Huh.
I like old cards. I like the look of old cards. It feels nostalgic to me. All right, Nate. I hope that was helpful. Nate, you also asked a much harder question, which I think we're going to maybe breeze over, which is just how do you decide when a card is too good for Peasant Cube? And I mean, transparently, I've never designed a Peasant Cube. Anthony, you have not either, correct?
Correct.
So that's a really big question of just how do you know when a card is too powerful for a cube? And I think that comes down to playtesting, taking that playtesting and turning it into explanatory knowledge of your environment. Like, if you had this experience playing a card, was that indicative of its normal play patterns, or was it an exception? Is that its ceiling, or is that its normal case outcome? And using that to weigh it against all of the other explanatory knowledge you have about all the other cards in the environment, and deciding if whatever delta is present is within your range of acceptable power level delta for your environment. And that's a very hard question. So I'm going to stick with the easy question, which is, keep playing Arkhim's Astrolabe, and maybe put a Gush in there too.
Some of the cards that seem way pushed for peasant environments are just the extremely efficient removal, like we're talking about Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile, where we just wouldn't see these printed in modern design. But they aren't
just to push back a little bit, Fatal Push and Bloodchief's Thirst are not that far off, in my opinion, from Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile.
That's true.
They're a different color. We would never see that in white now, I totally agree. And so if the color pie is a consideration, then sure. But I think those cards have a little bit more of an air of high power because they are like the cream of the crop. And so that's what you do see in Constructed Legacy, or you do see in EDH, for example. But I actually think that they're only a little bit better than the cards just below the cream of the crop, which don't show up in Constructed as much, or are only ever so slightly worse in drafted Singleton environments.
Sure. I mean, but more importantly, I think it's worth just noting, like, those cards are above par just because they're a little bit more mana efficient. They don't actually shape the game in a way that it's like, oh, you just suddenly have 3 more cards than me, and I can't win now. So I think it's much more reasonable in rarity restricted context just to include these hyper efficient cards much more than it is to include these cards that just generate a ton of card advantage and really take over the game in themselves. So I'd be much more willing to include those efficient removal as opposed to something like Treasure Cruise.
I do have Nate's list here, which I can send over to you, but some of the cards I'm seeing immediately jump out are like, this cube has Mother of Runes in it, which is a pretty pushed uncommon, I would say.
But similarly, like that card doesn't really break the philosophy of commons and uncommons, right?
I mean, it kind of breaks the philosophy of anything they put on any Magic card at any rarity these days, I would argue. Do you not think so?
It's tough.
I'll paste Nate's cube list here. The cards jumping out at me as being some of the most cards Nate does include in Peasant are cards like Mother of Runes, Palace Jailer, Animate Dead, though that card does go down in power level when everything is commons and uncommons. Young Pyromancer seems up there for me. Hymn to Turok for sure. That card is very, very, very good. Grafted Wargear. So like all of these cards I think are kind of head and shoulders above something like Arkhim's Astrolabe or a lot of the cards that show up on the Legacy ban list in most
I think Ancient Tomb stands out to me more than any of those.
Oh, is Ancient Tomb in here? Let's see, I have it sorted by ELO because I thought it was a pretty quick way to just, Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, there's 2 columns here. There's 2 separate rows of ELO, and the number 1 card is, Ancient Tomb. Woof, Ancient Tomb. Yeah, Lightning Bolt, Counterspell Remand, Ponder, Preordained Force of Will. Yeah, Wasteland 2, City of Brass. Yeah, these are all very good cards.
So City of Brass is maybe a better example where, like, it might be one of the most powerful cards in the cube, but it is not, in any case, backbreaking. It's not the card that you're going to see your opponent play and think, well, I just can't win this game anymore. And so I don't think it is unhealthy in terms of, like, damaging gameplay.
I agree. Thank you, Nate, for sending in that voice memo question. If you want to have your question answered on the air on Lucky Paper Radio, you can mail a voice memo to mail@luckypaper.co. I hope some of what we said was helpful. The other thing I want to talk about, Anthony, is there was a video posted to the subreddit this week that caused some conversation, and the video was titled, "Should Cubes Be Singleton?"
For me, it's kind of impossible to talk about the topic of power level without bringing up Singleton.
But Jason's point is really just encouraging Cube designers to break Singleton because he sees it as a pointless restriction. I think at some point he even says, like, I can't understand why anybody would ever not play a card that would make their cube more fun.
I don't see why you would set some arbitrary restriction on your ability to create fun.
I was curious what you thought of this video.
To the same point we made about restrictions, I'm worried to just use the same phrase of saying restrictions breed creativity. It's more like restrictions take a lot of pressure off of you so that you can actually just think clearly about things. And when you say you can build a cube, it can be anything, it can have any number of cards, it's so many decisions, it can be extremely daunting and hard to have a conversation when just anything is up in the air about, fine-tuning details of things.
Yeah.
On the other hand, of course, I'm never going to tell somebody, like, cube should look this way, and if you're going to play Magic, you should play it in this way. That's absurd.
I think there's something really important there, which is people say limitations breed creativity, but they very, very rarely explain why. And I think you touched on it in a very good way there, which is that restrictions don't breed creativity by inspiring you or sprinkling you with some magical creativity dust that now allows you to be smart and cool. What they do is, another example I can think of is I've done some wood carving in my life, which is, in one of my many lives. And one of the things that people really like about wood carving or stone carving, which I've also done, as opposed to carving, say, like a block of plaster or something, is that the wood and the stone both they exist in some form already. Like if you just pour some plaster into a rectangular prism mold and make like a plaster box, then you can carve whatever you want out of that plaster box, right? That's just a blank slate. Plaster is way easier to carve than stone or wood, so you can just do whatever you want. But the reason that so many artists prefer to work with stone or wood is not just because of the quality of the end result, but because of the process. Because the stone is already a shape. It has a grain. It has colorations and differences in the texture of different parts of the stone, which is essentially a restriction. The stone says you cannot...
It has the David inside of it.
It's not even that. It's that you can't carve the stone in a certain way, or it's much harder to carve the wood against the grain than it is to carve it with the grain. And so what it actually does is it limits the number of choices you can possibly make, and in doing so, you can actually consider the range of choices and make the one that serves your vision. Whereas if you're starting with a block, you better have a very, very, very good vision of what you want that block to be, because there is nothing limiting your choices. You just can make whatever choices you want. And so in some ways, it's the most freeing thing imaginable. But in reality, it just means that, all right, if I'm an artist and I sit down to carve my plaster rectangles, then what makes this plaster rectangle I'm carving right now different from the plaster rectangle I carved last week or the one a year and a half ago? There's no texture to the experience. I think that the reason that restrictions breed creativity is because they oftentimes eliminate a whole suite of options that you couldn't possibly consider the full range of when making a creative decision.
I mean, you're kind of just rephrasing restrictions, though. Like, really, it comes down to, I think, two things. One is it alleviates decision paralysis by removing a lot of potential options. And then it also just forces you to approach a thing in a different way. So whereas if you're approaching your solid plaster block, if you're approaching it on Friday the same way you did on Tuesday, you're probably going to just carve the same thing. But if you say, well, this one has a different grain, it's going to force you to look at it in a different way and consider some options which maybe you wouldn't have considered if you had the full breadth of all options.
And oftentimes it forces you to try things too. You say, oh, there's this cool vein in the rock here. Is there a way that I can carve this into a sweeping shape that holds out this cantilevered portion over here? And you might try something bold and daring that you otherwise wouldn't have tried in your plaster block because you didn't have something there to suggest that form to you. And so,
yeah, that's interesting. That almost feels less like a constraints breed creativity thing than just like having a nucleation site or a sort of seed idea.
Well, but I think that's what restraints are for almost every cube designer, or the vast, vast majority of cube designers. If you look at...
That's fair. Like, there's not much else to provide that kind of texture unless... I mean, obviously you can say, like, I want to build the Enchantment Matters cube and start with these particular set of cards.
Or, but you're just choosing a restriction for yourself. It's still a restriction, right?
Sure,
like
okay.
You're saying, I want these cards to be playable, these cards to be good. I mean, you can frame anything as a restriction, but if you look at the breadth of cubes out there, there are a lot of cubes in the like very roughly power maxed legacy vintage category, right? Cubes that are playing to within some subjective evaluation the most powerful cards within those environments to like push power level in one way or another, and cutting cards that either think are too good or don't serve the gameplay goals. There's set-based cubes where the sort of nucleation point of the restriction there is a set or a plane. There are cubes based on rarity restrictions, your peasants, your paupers. These are the most common cubes we have. There's the desert cubes that, you know, have all the lands in the actual packs, or old border cubes where the restriction is only cards that were printed in old border. I think you need something like that in order to actually begin a project and sink your teeth into something. So to get back to Singleton, which is a very, very common, probably the most common restriction for cubes, I would guess, off the top of my head. I think that one is so common because of a couple of reasons. One, Singleton just is cool. It's cool to only have one copy of a card, right? I remember when I first got into Magic, before I knew about Singleton formats, we were playing like kitchen table decks and stuff, and it was so frustrating to be like, well, I have this card that I like for my deck, but I need to get 3 more now for my deck to be any good because I only have one copy of this card I think is good in my off-meta modern deck or whatever. And it was just like a hassle. And then once you have 4 of them, they're not as special because now they're 4 of a kind. It's like, it's not your one special card that you have some emotional bond to. So I really do think that one of the reasons for the popularity of Singleton is that it means that people can justify, you know, really scraping and scrapping and saving up to get one copy of that card they love that's really expensive, or to play that one copy of that card that means something to them, they have a connection to. I think it's very evocative to play Singleton environments. That's how I felt when I first discovered Commander, and then later on Cube, and I think that's one of the reasons the limitation persists.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking a little bit about this earlier when we had discussed this topic, and you just stole all of my points. I think it's, like, I have framed it in the past as saying, like, Singleton is great for collecting, because
right. The first one is so much more valuable than the second, third, and fourth to you as a collector.
But it's so much more deep and nuanced than that. Like, it really is, like you said, like, you open up a foil in a draft, and you're like, wow, I can, like, put this card in my cube now, and that's so much more exciting than being like, well, I want to play Constructed. I just need 4 of all these cards. My option is basically, I just have to go buy these cards. I'm not really going to realistically collect all these cards and from drafts and whatever and be able to play in a competitive Constructed meta. That's really just not feasible. But in Singleton, whether you're playing Cube or Commander, that's absolutely practical, and it gives you that excitement that you want from opening cards. Like, it gives you the excitement when you're looking at someone else's trade binder and they have the one card you've been looking for a while, which you just don't get if it's like, well, you just have one, I need a complete playset to complete my modern deck, so this experience is kind of over.
Right, and it is a binary too. It's like, I didn't have it and now I have it. There's none of that in-between purgatory of like, I've got half of it, and so I don't know whether to try and finish the set or trade them off for something else to complete another set of something. There's none of that middle territory.
And like you said as well, it's so exciting to say, well, I saved up for, or I, went and sought out this one individual card. Once you have the one, buying the second one is a lot less exciting.
So much less exciting. I can say from experience, it's not fun. Whenever I get a card that's like, oh, this is good in one of my decks and also a cube, I'm like, oh, I gotta get 2 of this card? That just doesn't feel fun anymore. It doesn't feel like a hunt. It just feels like commerce. It's not as fun.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, Singleton makes it feel like a collectible card game rather than just buying a game.
I think it's a very important reason. I think it's one of the reasons why Singleton continues to persist throughout the Cube world. But it's a very squishy reason that doesn't address the game design criticisms for not breaking Singleton. Let's go over our history of Singleton in our own cubes. So we both break Singleton in our main cubes for fixing lands. And I think is a very common reason why the most breaking of Singleton I see is for fixing lands. And that is that when you're building a cube, a 360 card cube, most designers want to include more than 10 fixing lands, which means they're going to include multiple fixing lands for each guild that are essentially kind of fungible. Like, you just know you need 4 or 5 or however many fixing land cycles you want, and so you play the best ones and then you play the ones that aren't as good anymore because you ran out of the best ones, is what a lot of cube designers end up doing. Now, that's obviously, like, some people include the creature lands because they like that texture they add to the environment, or the cycling lands because of the extra versatility. Totally fine. That's still completely valid. I break Singleton for shocks, but I still include 1 of each fetch, and I still have other land cycles to fill things out, like the Horizon land. So it's all a delicate balance. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think the reason people break for fixing lands is that there is a natural ceiling. I'm even if I were to include only shock lands or only shocks and fetches in my cube, I wouldn't put 200 of them in because that's just too many fixing lands for my cube. So there's a natural limiter there. There's still a restriction that is somewhat imposed by the game itself.
Oh, you mean
Whereas,
not in terms of there's a ceiling in the quality of fixing lands, but just that even if you sort of decide to splurge, you can only splurge so hard.
right, but what I more mean is that if I were to decide to just say, well, I'm including Volcanic Hammer and Fire Ambush and all these other cards that are just essentially slightly worse lightning strikes, why not just put in more lightning strikes? Now you have to actually answer the question for yourself. How many lightning strikes?
Even more directly, if you just say, well, I'm going to break Singleton for lightning bolt, how many lightning bolts is the right number of lightning bolts?
Right. And then you have to answer that question for your environment, which we just talked about how it was not easy to even answer the question of, is Arkham's Astrolabe or Sensei's Divining Top too good for my peasant cube? Much harder is the question, is 4 or 7 or 11, like how many lightning bolts or lightning strikes is the right number for my cube for it to deliver on my gameplay goals? I don't
So whereas
think
you're
that's an easy
saying people
question.
are willing to break for fixing because there is kind of a natural restriction because people will say, different people will say different things, but they will say, here is the number of cycles of duels you should run for whatever size of cube.
Right. Each individual designer has their number of cycles they want to run, and so it's a very low cost to break for that fixing lands because it's not going to, and this is something that was addressed in the video, this slippery slope argument of like, well, how many, now just add more.
And there was a lot of backlash within the community where people would say that it was a slippery slope, or what would be there to stop me from running, say, 50 Black Lodi?
And I agree with the sentiment in the video that the slippery slope argument doesn't really have legs in the sense of you're not just going to now be required to put in 20 Black Lotuses in your cube because you're breaking Singleton. You obviously don't have to. You can run as many of whatever cards as you think serve your goals. But answering that question is so far from trivial. It's a really, really, really difficult question to answer. And so I think we see it broken for fixing lands because people have already answered that question for themselves. They already know how many fixing lands they want to run, and so they don't have to answer that question anew. They can just say, well, I'm just not going to include these tap lands. I'm going to include another set of shocks, or whatever fits their cube design goals, and it's a relatively small and like-for-like upgrade, whereas what's the right number of lightning bolts to serve my goals is a much harder upgrade.
Yeah, and the texture a lot of the sort of second tier of lands add to a game is not particularly interesting to me. Like, oh, I have a battle land and I have a check land, and oh wait, like I have my dual land. I just need to keep track of, do I care about having 2 basics in play or another basic in my hand? Like, that's not really, having those different effects in a cube is not actually adding to the fun.
I agree completely. Totally agree with that.
But is it more fun to have so many different burn spells?
Well, so hold on a sec. So we'll get there. I have also designed other cubes that break Singleton in different ways. The one I'll mention right now, just as a case study, is this tribal cube I've been fiddling with ever since the beginning of Call Time spoiler season. And it leans into that tribal theme that in Modern Horizons that you described so eloquently back in that episode where we talked about it, which is that you have a bunch of changelings and you have these narrow niche tribal payoffs or lords, and you're able to play a deck that consists of a few different tribal payoffs, like your Aeola Queen of Bears and the King of the Pride, which is a cat payoff and a bear payoff, and then you have all your changelings to trigger both, and so you end up playing this tribal deck. And I thought that was a really cool thing, and so I tried to build a cube around it, which I initially started as Singleton, except for fixing, which I break for immediately now whenever I start a new cube. And what I found was there just weren't enough changelings to get to the point where this kind of deck was really viable. And there was also, importantly, a big delta between the two places that they've printed changelings in Magic's history, which is Modern Horizons, which is a very powerful set from a couple years ago, and Lorwyn, which was a set from 12 or 15 years ago that was significantly less powerful than Modern Magic R&D. And so all the changelings from Lorwyn, pretty much, with only a few exceptions, are kind of non-starters in an environment where you're also playing the changelings from Modern Horizons. So what I ended up doing is breaking Singleton for those changelings, and it was very difficult. I'm still not there. I've only playtested this cube very minimally, but it's a very difficult question to answer. How many changelings is the right number of changelings? Because the thing I found about breaking Singleton, and this is what I wanted to get to, is that the other reason I think it's very prevalent in the cube design world is that the more you break Singleton, and this also includes virtually breaking Singleton, including Fire Ambush and Volcanic Hammer and all that kind of stuff, in addition to Lightning Strike, the more you include cards that are essentially fungible, they're interchangeable, the fewer decisions you give your drafters, and therefore the more on rails your entire draft environment becomes a little bit. And you can take that to its logical conclusion and imagine a cube that only has multiple copies of 12 different cards, and there's actually a finite number of 2-color decks you could possibly draft with different densities of these cards. And so you as the designer have to be damn sure that each of those 2-color decks is viable and works. And so the video where Jason mentions swapping out some of the dinkier aggro 1-drops for grave crawlers,
I first broke Singleton by replacing these boring linear black 1-drops with grave crawlers.
that's in some ways just you were already breaking Singleton for fungible black aggro creatures, and now you just made it a different black aggro creature. To me, that's a very insubstantial breaking of Singleton that doesn't actually begin to address the complexities involved with designing non-Singleton environments.
Totally. And I think that you're getting at something that's very important, which is when I'm designing a cube, or designing my main cube at least, this is a box of cards I want to get the maximum value out of. I want this to be as redraftable. I want to be able to open it up and play all kinds of different decks and get as much variation from my gameplay, because that's what I enjoy from Magic. So Singleton, in addition to being great for collecting and rewarding when you open up packs, it's also just really fundamental to just wanting to get as much variation out of the decks as possible.
I've felt more and more that there's a kind of fundamental divide in how some people think about their cubes, where some people, I think, have a kind of exploratory mindset where their goal is, and they can have any kind of goal. It doesn't matter what their goal is, but their goal is to explore a space with a set of cards. And what that means, I think, is maybe having a higher tolerance for cards that might be a different power level, or having a higher tolerance for polarizing cards, and just kind of being resigned to saying, all right, well, I'll let people draft this and see what happens. And there is no wrong way to draft the cube. Whatever people do, they do. And I'll try and then look at the results and see what I can learn from that. Versus a much more kind of rigid, prescriptive idea of what the viable decks in your cube are, and designing with those in mind at all times. And basically saying, well, if you're playing blue-black in my cube, you better be playing ninjas, because that's what this cube is about. It's about blue-black ninjas. And so there's this mindset where if your drafters are playing blue-black and they're not playing ninjas, they somehow messed up or didn't follow your clear signals or are drafting it wrong or whatever. And I think if you're more in that second mindset, you'll be pulled more to non-Singleton, because it gives you much greater control over your drafters, because you give them fewer decisions. More of those decisions have been put off on you. Whereas my natural pull at all times is to give my drafters more decisions and to revel and delight in any time someone does something unexpected. I told the story of Daniel running Doomscar in his white-black aggro deck and then getting me with it in back-to-back games with multiple cards that made his board indestructible, like Selfless Spirit. And is that what I intended when I put Selfless Spirit and Doomscar in? That's not what I was thinking of, certainly, but I am glad that those cards interact in that way, and I'm happy to include those cards so that that is one of the ways in which my cube can be played. And so if you are aiming for that other option, you want to give your drafters more decisions and see what they do with it, of course you want to play Singleton. You want them to have a decision to make between, do I take this card or that card? You don't want them to say, well, both these cards are Gravecrawler, so I guess I'm taking Gravecrawler.
On the other hand, sometimes I do think you can have the reverse effect by breaking Singleton, if it means you're bolstering a particular archetype or strategy or whatever kind of deck that just wouldn't be viable without breaking Singleton. And so really you're saying, okay, well, we have this cycling deck, but if it's really not viable without breaking Singleton, it's not actually a real decision that you're offering to your players. So potentially by breaking Singleton to add a couple more cards here and there, you can just enable even more options.
That's true. I totally agree with that. That I think sometimes breaking Singleton can make whole new decks appear where before there was no deck,
Right.
and cards are recontextualized, thus giving you virtually more cards, because now this one
Right.
card that was previously only playable in this one place now has two homes, and therefore it's kind of virtually two cards in the cube.
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between just looking at the cards and saying, well, how many literally unique combinations are there, and actually how many viable strategies are there that are going to appeal to and excite my players.
I think one of the most common manifestations of this exploratory cube design, too, is a lot of the people that are designing cubes at the limits of power level within their restriction, whether it be pauper or peasant or vintage or whatever. I think a lot of people are just well, I'm curious to know what is the most powerful deck I can draft. Like, what does the most powerful drafted environment within this set of restrictions look like? And so those players might see a new powerful card printed, and they might not like it. They might think, oh gosh, True Nemesis, I don't like that this card's not interactive. But in service of exploring what the most powerful drafted decks could possibly be, I'm going to include this card because it seems to me like it might be among this class of cards that are very powerful. There are plenty of cube designers working in that way, and that's totally valid. And that way of working is very much naturally inclined to Singleton, which is why I think we see so much of that in the community.
I just had a terrible idea.
Great, let's hear it.
It's going to be very expensive. So I just wanted to say to the people that are asking, like, well, this is a slippery slope, why not just put in a dozen Black Lotuses? And I wanted to say, well, sure, why not? Let's do it. If you think that Black Lotus is a fun Magic card to play with, I personally do not, you can put in a dozen Black Lotuses in your cube. But also, what if we just replace the basic land box with just a big stack of Lotuses?
That would be something.
I think if we want to do a weird stipulation draft sometime, just saying, like, tonight, this is the Lotus draft, could be a fun time.
Something I've considered doing before, which is in a vaguely related territory, a card I have thought a lot about for my cube is Lotus Petal. It's a card that fascinates me. It's just, a 0 mana artifact you can tap and sacrifice for a mana of any color. So, pure tempo embodied, right? You're spending a whole card for just a single mana ahead of schedule. So that'll let you play your 3-drop on turn 2, or your 2-drop on turn 1, or your 5-drop on turn 4, but it costs you a whole card to do so. So you better be getting a significant advantage by making that early play. And it's a card that I've wondered if it would work in my environment before. And I thought one of the most interesting ways to test that would have been just to say at the end of the draft, all right, everybody, you drafted your deck. You may now include as many copies of Lotus Petal as you think your deck wants. And I'm curious to know what kinds of numbers my drafters would land on for that.
It would be weird. It's also funny to hear you say that, because I look at Lotus Petal and I'm like, oh, this is a cool synergy card that I can play with my Emery and my Sai.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a layer I did not explain, but you're right. That's certainly there too. I wonder how many Lotus Petals do you think you would play if you drafted, classic green-white mid-range in my cube? How many petals you putting in that deck, you think?
Is green-white mid-range a deck in your cube?
You've drafted it before. It's a great deck.
I've certainly drafted the green-white O3 in your cube. Is that what you're referring to?
That was a long time ago. You should try green-white now. It's spicy. It gets the job done. 7 Lotus Petals? Does that sound like a good number?
It depends how many planeswalkers I have.
Like,
right?
Cut 5. You have like probably 3 or 4 planeswalkers if you're playing green-white mid-range in my cube. Maybe even 5 if you got lucky.
Yeah, stick a planeswalker turn 2. Love it.
I think I would play 7-ish Lotus Petals, cutting like 5 lands in my 2 worst spells for 7 Lotus Petals. See how that would go. Maybe even play more in aggro. Yeah, I mean, to answer the question, should cubes be Singleton? I mean, no, cubes shouldn't be anything. That's not what cube is. Cube should be whatever you want your cube to be, and that's the beauty of the environment. I think there are very good reasons why many designers choose to follow Singleton as a rule. And I actually think more people do it consciously than perhaps like unconsciously inherit it as some dogma of the environment, which seems to be the position of this video, that most people that aren't breaking Singleton just haven't thought to not break Singleton. I actually think most players probably have thought about it and decided consciously not to.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty reasonable approach to say, stick with the convention, stick with Singleton, because it does have all these benefits. And then if you see a real problem or a real opportunity for a new kind of archetype you're trying to support, then feel free.
All this talk of Lotus Petal and Black Lotus, though, Anthony, is going to make me recount some research I've been doing this week. I have really fallen in love, specifically in the Degenerate Micro Cube, with Lion's Eye Diamond. This is a card that I'm just really enamored with right now because, I mean, I think most people know, but Lion's Eye Diamond is a 0 mana artifact that you can sacrifice, discard your hand, and then, after that, add 3 mana of any one color to your mana pool.
It's really cool. I'm really glad they finally printed this card, which really, I think is going to make, finally, Bag of Holding relevant in constructed formats.
I guess before I wax poetic about Lion's Eye Diamond for a moment, what do you think about Lion's Eye Diamond? How do you feel about this card?
I mean, I feel like I still am a Stone Age, like, when was this printed? 1994? 95? 96? I still look at it and I'm like, this is a bad Magic card. Discard my hand? No way, I don't want to do that. These are all my favorite cards in my hand.
Well, it's funny. So I went back to some of the earliest episodes of Drive to Work. Hi, Morrow. To try and find a story about the design of Lion's Eye Diamond. And apparently, Charlie Catino, who has been working at Wizards since the very, very early days, since well before Mark Rosewater, is a big proponent of putting actively bad cards in sets, which is, frankly, not a design ethos we see manifested in modern set design. People still will give Wizards crap and say they're printing bad cards, but compared to what they did in 94, 95, 96, they're not printing bad cards anymore, friends. The cards they printed back then were, like, intentionally bad, almost as a joke, like, isn't it funny we bothered to print this card, and just, like, as a weird kind of throwaway thing. So
I mean, I personally love that. I wish we would see so much more of that. Unfortunately, I think we've seen a lot more attention paid to limited design, which overall I think is a net positive. But when you look at some of these old cards and you immediately are like, what is this card? Like, how do I make this work? Why does this exist? That's such an intriguing and awesome aspect of the game, which we really just don't see that much anymore.
I agree, though I have to say, like, my impression is that this card was, when it was printed, there was no way to make it work. There was no answer. It wasn't like it was a little secret like nugget and you could figure out how to make it work. It was meant to be bad intentionally, and it was. And players were like, this card's awful and I hate it. And you can even read a column of Mark Rosewater's from the early days where someone wrote him this hilariously disrespectful long letter about why Wizards is printing bad Magic cards, and it's a disgrace and offensive to players that spend their hard-earned money on a booster pack only to open a garbage card, like, for example, Lion's Eye Diamond. I think this person says in the letter, like, can you ever possibly imagine any deck that would play Lion's Eye Diamond in it and be successful? It's impossible.
I could forgive this if you were talking about cards like, for instance, Teferi's Response. That card, while weak, does have its uses in some sideboards. I have never in all my years seen anyone play a Lion's Eye Diamond, for any reason.
And of course, Lion's Eye Diamond turned out a couple years later to be not just a powerful card, but an extraordinarily powerful card. Very, very potent build around. And so here's what I like about it. I like that it was designed kind of as a joke, as this actively bad card that was like, discard your hand, haha, now you don't have to spend this mana on. I guess you can use it for an activated ability or whatever. It's a callback to Lotus, which is the most powerful and iconic card in Magic's history in a lot of ways, but also, I also don't like the design of Black Lotus. Like, it's a cool icon, but I don't think it's fun to play with in any sense. So it's a callback to this card that I like for history reasons, but don't want to play in my own environments. But because it's way, way, way worse, but still very, very good, it is playable in other environments. Lion's Eye Diamond is. And then in the Degenerate Microcube, it's been a ton of fun to play, and I keep finding little scenarios where it just ends up performing really, really well. I recently added Gushsa's Scepter to the Degenerate Microcube, which is it's a 0-mana artifact from Alliances that basically says you can tap it to exile a card from your hand under it, or you can tap it to take a card from exile under it and put it back in your hand. So you just can shuffle cards between being under Gushsa's Scepter and being in your hand. And this was one of the early cards that was kind of messed up with Lion's Eye Diamond, because you could put a card under it on turn 1, and then on turn 2, you could crack your Lion's Eye Diamond, and then afterwards put the card back in your hand and cast it with the mana from Lion's Eye Diamond. And so this is a combo that, like, was good for like a hot second there in Magic's history, but since then, Scepter, I think, has been woefully unplayable. And I'm so thrilled that this combo is now a thing again in my Degenerate Microcube, which I didn't consciously plant, right? I didn't think I want to make this combo playable, but it's just the way this cube plays out ends up having these weird little interactions from the early days of Magic that are still viable in fun ways. So I'm really kind of just enamored with Lion's Eye Diamond these days, and I wish it didn't cost a gazillion $1 million so more people could have them and play with them.
Yeah, sounds like Magic the Gathering.
That's maybe your worst canned response yet.
What do you think I'm actually going to make a hot take on the reserve list at this point? There are no more hot takes to be made.
Oh, I wasn't looking for you to do that. No.
Oh, okay.
I have no desire to hot take about the reserve list. I think it's a cool card. People should proxy it. How about that? Let's just say that.
I hate the word proxy. That's my hot take.
Gosh, it's not a great word. People should take a Sharpie and write Lion's Eye Diamond on a Post-it note and stick it in a
Make a little counterfeit for yourself. If we're gonna be honest.
Explicitly, let's not say counterfeit, because that's the difference. We don't want to encourage counterfeiting. Proxying is fine, though.
But that's the problem, is proxying is not proxying.
What you mean?
If you're just playing... This is a different episode.
Is your problem with the word proxy that some pedantic, like, well, proxy actually means that it points to a different destination?
Correct.
What's your argument here?
Yeah, I mean, you're saying, like, if I was to proxy a card, it would mean, like, yeah, I have my Lion's Eye Diamond. It's in this perfect, some kind of secure enclave, and I'm instead going to play with this planes that says Lion's Eye Diamond, and I'll shuffle with that, and it'll be fine. You're not proxying anything. You're just playing with not a real Magic card.
One of my friends has a beautiful thought, which I like, which is, the kind of thought you can only think when you're a person of somewhat reasonable financial privilege. But their position is just that in order to try and stop themselves from wanting things and, being desirous of buying new stuff for themselves, they just like to adopt the mindset that I own everything in the world. I can have it whenever I want. It's just stored in storage. And in order to get it out, I have to pay some money to get it out of storage. And then I can put it back in storage and get some of that money back as buying things and reselling them on eBay or whatever. And just think about it with Magic cards, Anthony. We all own all of the Lion's Eye Diamonds. Somewhere there's a Lion's Eye Diamond sitting in disuse. And that's the one that you're proxying if you write Lion's Eye Diamond on your Pestermite.
But please do not destroy a Pestermite. That's a very cool card.
Sure. All right, this has been Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for tuning in. I wanted to give a quick shout out to all of the great listeners that left us a review in response to my heartfelt plea for reviews last week on the show. So thank you to PL Lamascus, BBBDJ, Zaldanork, Boone Garrington, Airpower 220, and Forest 716, whose cube we just did a pack one pick one of. Thank you for the great reviews, everybody. I appreciate it. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are made by Mark Rosewater and Wizards of the Coast. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you, Anthony, for talking about Magic with me.
Thank you on my birthday for talking about Magic with me.
Oh, you did the callback. I didn't even have to do it. I was going to call back to it, but you got there.
Snaked it.